Now we'll learn how to calculate the Banzhaf power index. Remember that we're going to base this on coalitions, and recall that a coalition consists of all the players who vote the same way on a motion. Now, a coalition is either a winning coalition, that is to say it has enough votes to pass the motion, or it's a losing coalition. Also remember the idea of a critical player. A member of a winning coalition is said to be a critical player if that player's votes make the difference between winning and losing. The Banzhaf power index, which is due to John Banzhaf, is based on the following simple idea. We're going to measure a player's power by how often that player is a critical player. So here's how we do it. I will explain it first and then we will do an example. So for player I, let BI denote the number of winning coalitions in which he or she is critical. For example, if it's player number 1, then B1 means the number of winning coalitions in which player 1 is critical. So for each player we can compute this number. If there are 7 players, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, then there will be 7 numbers, B1, B2, and so on down to B7. Now, add those all up, and we'll get a number that we will call T. It's the total. It's the sum of all these numbers. And then using that number T as a denominator, we're going to take the BI's and divide by T, and that will give us other numbers which we'll denote by beta I. Notice we're using now the Greek letter beta, and this is our definition of the Banzhaf power index. So for each player now we have to find a number, beta I, and that is called player I's Banzhaf power index. Notice by the way that these numbers are defined, they will add up to 1. So we can think of them, as I've said before, as fractions of a whole pie, for example. Okay, so let's review how we would calculate this. First of all, we need to list all the winning coalitions. That could be a rather tedious job, but let's suppose that we go ahead and do that. We list all the winning coalitions. We then have to, in each winning coalition, indicate the critical players, and we have done that by underlining. Having done the underlining, now the next step is very simple. Just count how often each player is underlined. For example, count how often player 1 has been underlined, and that's B1. Count how often player 2 has been underlined, that's B2, and so on. Do this for all the players. Now add up all these BI's, B1 plus B2, and so on, to get T. Finally, divide each BI by T to get beta I. So that's how the calculation goes. Now, you should have a handout in which we're going to work out an example. Look for that handout, and we're going to work our way through that. Okay, here is that example, and it involves the weighted voting system 3, 2, 1, 1, 1. That is to say, there are 4 players. Player 1 has 2 votes. Each of the other players has a single vote. That will give you a total of 5 votes, and thus the quota is 3. It takes 3 votes to pass a motion. Now, what we need to do is to make a list of the winning coalitions and indicate the critical players. Well, let me first of all remark, as I do right here, that there are no one-player winning coalitions. Nobody alone has 3 votes. So there's no one-player winning coalition. To say that another way, there is no dictator. All right, let's list the 2-player winning coalitions. And let's start with the first 2 players, player 1, player 2. That's certainly a winning coalition. There are 3 votes. And player 1 together with player 3, again, that's 3 votes, so that's a winning coalition. Player 1 and player 4, and they have 3 votes. But if we leave out player 1 and take any other two players, that's only 2 votes. So none of those are winning coalitions. Thus we have a complete list of the 2-player winning coalitions. Before we go on, let's figure out who's critical. And as a matter of fact, that's quite simple because we've already observed that there's no dictator. So if you take any 2-player winning coalition and you remove one of the players, it becomes a losing coalition, and that means that all the players are critical in all the 2-player winning coalitions. So we underline them as I've just done. I hope you can see that underlining. Alright, let's go on to the 3-player winning coalitions. Now, since there's only 4 players, a 3-player coalition consists of all the players except 1, and so we can systematically list them by thinking who to leave out. We can leave out player 4, and that gives us players 1, 2, and 3. We can leave out 3, giving us 1, 2, 4. We can leave out player 1, giving us 1, 3, and 4. Or we can leave out player 1, giving us 2, 3, and 4. And notice all of those are winning coalitions. Even the last one has 3 votes altogether. So all of these are winning coalitions. Now let's figure out who's critical. Well, how do we do that? Let's consider this 3-player winning coalition consisting of players 1, 2, and 3. And if you leave out player 1, well, you're left with players 2 and 3, and looking up above, we can see that's not a winning coalition. That means that player 1 is critical, so let me underline player 1. On the other hand, if you leave out player 2, well, you're left with player 1 and player 3, but we know that's a winning coalition. So player 2 is not critical in this coalition. By the same thinking, player 3 is not critical in this coalition. The same reasoning applies to the coalition 1, 2, and 4. 1 is critical because if 1 is removed, it won't be a winning coalition. However, if you remove 2 or you remove 4, you still have a winning coalition, as you can see above, and therefore only player 1 is critical. A similar analysis shows that in the coalition 1, 3, 4, only player 1 is critical. And then finally we come to this coalition consisting of players 2, 3, and 4. But if we leave out any one of those players, we have a 2-player coalition that does not include player 1, and none of those are winning coalitions. That tells us that every one of these players is critical, so every one of them should be underlined. So I've underlined 2 and 3 and 4. And now don't forget to list the 4-player winning coalition, also known as the Grand Coalition, consisting of all the players. And if you leave anybody out, it's still a 3-player coalition, which is a winner. So in fact, nobody is critical here. Nobody should be underlined. Okay, now I actually did this calculation ahead of time, so I know how things are going to come out. How would we calculate, for example, B1? Well, we have to go back and see where player 1 was underlined, and player 1 was underlined here, and here, and here, and here, and here, and here. That's 6 times. 6 times we've underlined player 1, and therefore, as I've told you here, player 1, B1 is equal to 6, I should say. B1 is equal to 6. For the other players, if you go ahead and count, for example, player 2 has only been underlined twice. The same thing with player 3 and player 4. So B2 and B3 and B4 are all equal to 2. Now what is T? Well, T must be 12, right? It's 6 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2. And so we're going to get the Banzhaf power indices by dividing each of the B's by 12. So it's 6 over 12, and 2 over 12, and 2 over 12, and unfortunately the next one is on my next page. But there it is, 2 out of 12. Of course, these fractions can be reduced. This is equal to 1/2. So the Banzhaf power index for the first player is 1/2. For the other players, it's always 1/6. As I said, these numbers add up to 1. We should think that if the total power is 1, player 1 has half the power, and the other players each have an equal 1/6 of the power. Let me also mention an example from your assignment. You'll notice in your assignment that I have a rather elaborate problem having to do with the presidential election in 2012. So this is an analysis that was done before the presidential election in 2012 by the New York Times. When we vote for president, we vote via something called the Electoral College, and this means, with a couple of exceptions, that all the electoral votes of a state just go to a single candidate, whatever candidate has won that state, and it doesn't matter how thin the margin has been. You may remember, or at least know from history, about the presidential election in 2000, in which the vote in Florida was extremely close, and yet one candidate was going to receive all of the votes. They either all had to go to Bush or go to Gore, and there was quite an uproar about this. It wasn't resolved until more than a month after the election, and there was actually a Supreme Court decision. Anyway, the result of having an electoral college is that certain states are up for grabs and other ones are considered by everybody to be safely in the camp of one candidate or another. Now, according to this particular analysis from the New York Times, which was done early in 2012, there were 9 states that were really up for grabs. You'll notice that Ohio is on this list. According to this analysis, counting the safe votes as safe, Obama needed to win 54 of the 115 electoral votes that were available from these states. So here we're looking at that problem in your assignment, and we can regard this as a situation where there are players. The players are the 9 states. And notice it's a weighted voting situation. The players have varying number of votes. Ohio has a weight of 18. Pennsylvania has a weight of 20. Now, what Obama was looking to do was to get at least 53 of the available votes. Notice that here, for once, we're breaking our rule that our quota will always be a simple majority. It turns out that, according to this analysis, Obama already had a little bit of an edge among the safe states, so that among the 115 votes that were up for grabs, he didn't quite need to win a simple majority. He needed to win 53. So the important number, the quota for Obama, was 53. Well, what one can do is to go through and calculate all the winning coalitions and all the critical players. As you can imagine, this could be a rather tedious job. Since there are 9 players, there's lots of possible coalitions to consider. So this is not a calculation one would want to do by hand. But using a spreadsheet, I was able to do this without too much trouble, and I could figure out how many winning coalitions there were. And within each winning coalition, I could figure out which players were critical, and that meant that finally I could figure out those numbers B1, B2, and so on that are used in the Banzhaf power index calculation. And in fact, I give you those results, so you don't need to do that calculation yourself. That would be a real chore. I simply tell you the B1, B2, and so on. So for example, B1 is 217. Player 1 is Florida, and Florida was critical in 217 winning coalitions. I give you the numbers for all the other states, and then one of the things I ask you to do in this assignment is, from that, to figure out the Banzhaf power indices. And this should be thought of as a measure of, indeed, how powerful those states were in the upcoming election. One more thing before I leave this example is to note what actually happened. What actually happened on election day last year. Well, it turns out Obama won every one of these 9 states.